Thank you. So, good evening and welcome to tonight's meeting of the Economy, Place, Access and Transport Scrutiny Committee. This is the first meeting of this committee since our scrutiny structure has been altered slightly. Let's hope we start and continue as last year's committees went, which I thought were quite useful and sometimes tasty in places. Thank you to those who are with us tonight, and thank you to the millions joining us from home via YouTube. I'll do my best to make sure we're finished in time for the Great British Bake Off to start. A bit of housekeeping before we get into the agenda. I'm not expecting any fire drills, and if anyone needs the toilet, just through there at the back. If anyone needs support getting there, if you speak to one of the democracy officers to my right, we can deal with that sensitively. Yeah, and I think that's pretty much it. So we'll go straight into the agenda. Any declarations of interest before we continue? No, silence is golden. Thank you. We do have two sets of minutes from the previous version of this committee from March this year. I think we have a bit of an overlapping committee membership. So any members from those previous committees, might you have any amendments to suggest from those two sets of minutes? I don't think so. No? Great. So I'm happy to sign off. Sorry, forgive me, Councillor Rowley.
Sorry, Chair, I don't seem to see any apologies on the agenda. It's just to give Councillor Stewart's apologies, that's all.
Yeah.
Hearing this said.
Fair play. Thank you, Councillor Rowley. Yes, so Councillor Chris Stewart has sent his apologies, and Councillor Rowley is substituting for him to take the Conservative Party seat tonight. Thank you. So yeah, I'm happy to sign off on the minutes from the 8th of March. I have mentioned to the democracy officer that I just want to review the minutes from the meeting on the 21st of March. I just want to double check that the actions we agreed at the time are exactly as they've been noted. I'm not sure they are, but I will get onto that in the coming day or two. If there's anything substantial that needs to change, we'll bring those minutes back to the next meeting and sign off properly. So thank you for that. So the next agenda item is public participation. Tonight, we only have one speaker for public participation, although we do have some extra guests as part of the main committee, which I'll elaborate on shortly. So that's Gwen Swinburne. Please take a seat, Gwen. You know the drill by now.
Potentially messed up here, so if I mess up, I'm sorry. Thank you, Chair. I have a number of governance concerns that I hoped might end up as scrutiny topics for this committee. Regarding highways improvements and capital projects in any form, I have been unable to extract from officers anything that can usefully be used to understand how they prioritise, what is prioritised in rank order and what is completed. After months, some material has been supplied, which does not include ranking criteria, outturn costs, fee estimates, and so on. Considering the difficulties in finances, surely we should be able to see these. I was told in a very long overdue FOI that the 23-24 Highways Maintenance Programme has not yet been published. How can this happen? I rely once again on North Yorkshire Council for a far more transparent system, with changes and adjustments to the programme reported regularly via officer and/or member decision sessions. This applies equally to street lighting upgrades and no doubt other programmes in Mr. Ferris's directorate. Would you please consider adding this as a scrutiny topic at some point? Secondly, Chair, a decision to suspend the Highways Design Guide in its entirety was slipped on as a long officer decision early in August. This leaves developers and others in a complete limbo. Officers say they will issue interim guidance, yet not when or what is to be done meanwhile. Should scrutiny address how this happened and ensure a remediation programme, including immediate advice to developers, is available? My final point, Chair, you made in part scrutiny yesterday. It was about the weighting applied to consultations and consultees. I wanted to extend that to ask that you make sure that as a consultation is conducted, consultees are left in no doubt that theirs are one of a number of issues that will be combined to make a decision. I say this as so often the public say you ignored us, especially by loud lobbies. As you know, your jobs are the hardest, balancing competing views, the law, our safety, your policies, money, and so much more. That it's never made clear to consultees that theirs is only one of a number of inputs that have to be considered. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Gwen. We'll take your comments into account. In terms of the work plan remarks, we will look at that. I know you already appreciate that completing a work plan is a challenge, pending resources and time, but there are always ways we can do things better. So thank you. Cheers. Enjoy your evening. Okay, so we'll now move on to the main item on tonight's agenda, which is to look at blue badge holder access. Now, the reason why this is on the work plan is because during our work planning meetings earlier this summer, which were cross-party affairs, the members of this committee wanted to receive an update on the new administration's work to reversing the blue badge ban, to coin a phrase following the name of the relevant campaign. It's obviously a very sensitive subject. It's been doing the rounds now for a number of years. I hope that we can have a constructive discussion tonight, and absolutely let everybody speak their mind, but do so in a way that is still respectful. That would be great. We do have some guests with us who I'm effectively treating as committee members without a vote. Now, we don't often have votes on this committee, so you're not missing out on too much. But I'm very grateful for your presence. I'll introduce the names I've got here, but I do realise I've also got a number of council officers around the table as well. For the council officers, if and when you do speak, please just introduce yourself at that point. Otherwise, we're going to have loads of introductions to do. The first guest we've got is taking part in the committee discussion remotely, and that's Professor Paul. I really hope it's Greedy, but I've heard it pronounced Grady, so I apologise in advance. Paul, can you correct me one way or another on that, if you can hear me?
Yes, I can. It's Grady. Thanks.
Thank you for clearing that up. So Paul is a co-director of the Centre for Applied Human Rights at the University of York. We also have Ian Mitchell, Regional Manager from the Thomas Pocklington Trust, also connected with the York Sight Loss Council. Also present, we have Andrew Lowson, who's the Executive Director of York BID, Business Improvement District. Another remote participant is Flick Williams, who's part of the York Disabled Rights Forum and the Reverse the Ban campaign. Flick, can you hear me okay?
I can, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. We also have Sean Tunstall, who's the Counter-Terrorism Security Advisor, and Superintendent Dan Patrick from the head of Protect, Prepare, who is the head of Protect, Prepare and Borders for Counter-Terrorism Policing. Thank you all for joining. One thing I've said to not all of our guests, sadly, but I'll say it now for everyone's awareness. If any of our one-off guests want to make an opening speech, they can. What we'll do first, though, is we'll receive the officer's report and then I'll come to you. So we have a report in these papers which council officers will present as normal. And then we tend to go into a committee discussion which involves questions to those officers, sometimes statements, but we prefer questions. Otherwise, it'll just become a speech brigade. But if our guests would like to make an opening statement for a few minutes, once we've received the report, you can feel free to do so, but there's no pressure either. If you just want to dip into the discussion when you want to, that's fine. Welcome, Councillor Healy. I know you've had a bit of a job recently in the last few minutes or so. It's good to have you with us. So, council officers, if we can have the sort of brief summary of the report that you've provided with us tonight, that'd be great. James, are you going to lead on it? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so thank you, Chair. I'm James Gilchrist. I'm the Director for Environment, Transport and Planning. So this report, as you succinctly said, revisits the decision of November 21, which was to extend the area protected by the hostile vehicle mitigation measures and to permanently exclude blue badge holders from that area. It's on the forward plan for October's executive as a pending decision, and the paper before you tonight sort of sets out where officers are at in that thinking, and obviously anything the committee can do to contribute towards that executive report is to be welcomed. So the report sets out the various decisions that led to that decision in November 21, setting out the history, but also sets out those decisions made since, including the decisions to exclude other vehicles such as the fishmonger, bank deliveries, etc. The report also focuses on what has changed, and most notably there's a new policy context since the decision was made in November 21. We have a new council plan with one of the 4 key commitments being about equalities and human rights. We've also undertook an engagement on the principles of permitting blue badge access that actually closed the day after this report was published, but we're starting to get those results through now, and they will absolutely help inform that executive decision. What the report does is it outlines the way officers perceive blue badge holders could be allowed access through the hostile vehicle mitigation measures. And the way we envisage that working, certainly initially, is with a security presence at Blake Street and at Goodram Gate, the 2 access points, who will check blue badge holders, match their badge, then permit access through the sliding bollards during pedestrianised hours. That does obviously have a cost implication, and we'll need to flesh that out for the executive report. As you've mentioned, we're joined by counter-terrorism policing colleagues, but in essence, the security advice has not changed in that the less vehicles that are within the secure zone, the lower the risk of an attack. Their sort of advice is that we should be focusing our protection on the highest footfall locations. So the report recognises the advice that permitting more vehicles into the foot streets raises the risk, and that some events increase footfall significantly, such as the Christmas market. So permitting blue badge access to a certain extent is about the level of risk the council or the executive as decision makers is prepared to tolerate. So what we've tried to do is think about ways we can mitigate any increased risk that has been identified. So as previously during the Christmas market, blue badge holders were historically their exemption to allow them access was withdrawn for Christmas markets prior to 2019, I think. What the report also does is talk about an anti-terrorism traffic regulation order, which means that the police can act if they are aware of intelligence to sort of secure the city at very short notice. So to a certain extent, as previously, the decision makers will need to weigh up the security advice with the many quality and human rights impacts, and in making a decision, consider those mitigations that we've thought about to sort of reduce that increased risk, and make a decision in the context of the council's policies. So in essence, this is about proportionate decision making and risk management. Sorry, seem to have attracted a moth. And I think that probably just about covers it, really.
Thank you, James. Much appreciated. Before we dive into the main discussion, just have 2 things to say. One thing I should have said earlier on is, if anybody wants to speak, if you've not done this before, just raise your hand and I'll try and catch you. If I don't catch you first time, wave more erratically. If I don't catch you then, please just shout, all right? I'm not that precious, but I will make a list of everybody I see if you want to ask a question or make a comment. The second thing I want to raise is that we'll now go to our guests just to see if they want to make their own opening comment. I'll come to you first, Professor Paul Grady. Oh, that's the most nervous I've felt all night about the issue at hand.
Thank you very much. There are just three quick points that I'd like to make, really. The first relates to the police advice. Obviously, the police advice on this issue is hugely important, and with good reason, the detail of that advice needs to remain confidential. But I think it's important to note that for those who've been arguing for enhanced access to the city centre, we don't fully know what we're arguing against. It's felt throughout as though, to some extent, the playing field, if you like, of this discussion has been uneven. And when I was reading the background documents, I guess a couple of questions came to mind. The first one is the extent to which this particular measure around hostile vehicle mitigation is part of a broader security plan. I assume it is. But it's never been clear to me from reading the documents, really the outlines of what that plan would be. And again, there may be reasons for that. I think the other issue I would raise is attention to this specific issue, vehicle access, warranted in the context of this wider plan. There's a history in anti-terrorism measures of fighting yesterday's battles. The measures that are being proposed, or the exclusion as it stands, wouldn't have prevented the poisonings in Salisbury in 2018, wouldn't have prevented the car driving into the hospital in Liverpool in 2021. Recent terrorist attacks have included single-person attacks, bladed weapons attacks, and so on. So my questions really are around the broader context of this single measure. There clearly is a nail to be hit here, but it, in the past, at least in terms of the previous regime, seems to me to have been hit with a very large hammer. I pushed the executive to question the police about the larger plan and whether the specific focus on vehicle access is really the priority and proportionate. My second point is about the balancing of rights, and we've already heard from the officer that this is a question really of balancing rights, the rights of a minority group, so blue badge holders, to access, against the right to life of all residents. There's a lot of reference in the background documents to consultation on this issue. But in May 2023, we had the biggest local consultation process that our democracy allows, local government elections. And two parties pledged to reverse the blue band exclusion within their manifestos. The fact that Labour, for whom it was their number one pledge, won, seems to me to be a game changer and is clearly part of the reason for this meeting. It's partly a game changer because it allows us to go beyond thinking in terms of minorities holding rights against a majority in this case. Because the majority voted here to align themselves with the minority. The majority voted, in terms of Labour winning that election, for a manifesto that included reversing this ban. And it seems to me that you could argue that the voters agreed in part to share responsibility for any enhanced risk that comes with reversing the blue badge exclusion. This can be now seen as a collective decision that the city has made through the electoral process. The third point I want to make briefly is around consultation. There's been an enormous amount of consultation, yet profound disagreement and division remains. I know that there is reflection within the council, and I think this reflection needs to continue about, in a sense, the consultation process more broadly being broken really within the city. I think the blue badge consultation is a symptom of a wider challenge. I understand that many of the officers involved in this would have done the consultation processes with good intention, but it's really important, I think, to acknowledge that many of those on the receiving end felt that the consultation was performative. It was really about a decision that was already made, and the consultation was really just tick boxing legal requirements and so on. So moving forward, I would urge the executive to prioritize quality over quantity, and also to think about a balance between having suggestions and proposals on the table and being open to new ideas. It wasn't clear to me reading the background document what the standing of the three options is. So in consultation that's going to happen, are these exclusive options that people are going to be asked to choose between, or are they indicative possibilities of outcomes with the council open to other suggestions? Given the history of consultation on this issue, it's really important that the parameters of the consultation are clear and that it's as open as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Paul. Very much appreciated. I'll move on to Ian Mitchell. Might you have anything to say at this point? It's fine if not.
Thank you, Chair. I want to speak from the lived experience perspective, if I can. I echo everything that Paul said in his comments about this being larger than just a few people deciding as an anti-terrorist measure we need to enforce a blue badge embargo. He's right. The biggest consultation we had ensured that Labour on their manifesto was given an overall majority. It saw the decimation of the Greens who supported the Lib Dems in this. And I think you had a clear message, not just from disabled groups, but from the larger community, that this is a discriminatory, unfair act. There was one young man who wrote on one of the cards that we did as reverse the ban, I haven't been into the city centre since the ban was introduced, and I won't go back until it's lifted. That's a taxpayer. That's somebody who pays to live in this city, but is actually disenfranchised from actually accessing it because he can't get in. He can't have the mobility. I speak on behalf of blind and partially sighted people, and you might think it's just a mobility issue for blue badge holders, but we have rehabilitation, which teaches us routes to actually navigate around. When we can't use those routes, you may as well drop us off in a foreign city. We have no idea where we are. We have no access to goods and services. And the purple pound is worth millions in this country by preventing people from meeting the people that they want to associate with. You cost cafes because those groups will go out to the outlying areas and not visit the city centre. You also restrict tourism as well, because people that are reliant on being able to get around are prevented. They'll go somewhere else. But more importantly, you deny us the services that we should be entitled to as part of our everyday lives, visiting banks, going to post offices, shops, picking up prescriptions. These are all what I would consider are the rights of every single human being. Going to the theatre, going to the cinema, viewing exhibitions, being a part of the community, all those things are denied to us. So can I please just say, enough consultation. We know what the right thing is to do. Consultation should be about informing people, getting their views and acting on them, not delaying a process because it suits somebody else's agenda, or not just doing a tick box exercise because that's what we need to do. Do the right thing. The councillors themselves, I think, are fully aware of what needs to be done in this context, and I just hope they get the support from the officers to do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Ian. Much appreciated. Andrew Lawson, would you like anything to say at this point, or?
I think I'd be more maybe comment more as discussion progresses. I mean, York Bid represents about 900 businesses in the city centre, just for those people who I suppose who aren't aware of that. yes, obviously this has been a hot topic of discussion over the past few years. I mean, I think when we reacted to the latest survey, or we asked businesses to react to it, I suppose actually the overwhelming comment that was there was, why are we being asked this question? Because if actually the reverse the ban is, you know, is part of the Labour manifestation, is this actually going to be worth our time consulting on? Which I suppose what I'm saying there is there was almost like a cynicism that it's a done deal, and what's the point of even, you know, me coming to the scrutiny committee, and are there discussions to be had going forward? I mean, we obviously encourage people to add those comments, because, you know, we're hopeful that there is the opportunity to shape a forward strategy. And I would slightly differ with some of the views that have been put forward, because I actually felt it was a shame that the access to the city centre was played out in a political arena, because I think actually some sensible discussions weren't able to be had because of that. And I remember actually talking to Councillor Burton, you know, this was coming out of COVID, and saying, listen, I'm very keen for you to understand that, you know, we do not want this to be a business versus, you know, blue badge access situation, because as the points have been made, you know, the disabled community you know, there's huge spend, you know, and our businesses want that. I think what has been maybe felt amongst the business community is some of the sensible discussions on details, looking for compromises within the city, haven't necessarily been allowed to be discussed because of the fact it was played out in that election arena. So what's done is done. I think we are very keen to actually, you know, continue to engage, understand what is feasible, you know, where there isn't room for negotiation, understanding all views, and see what sensible compromises can be made going forward. I think on the counter-terrorism part, because this is the thing, it's that adds another element to it. And again, I think, you know, speaking to businesses, this is where it can get very confusing. You know, it's, you know, because obviously in these papers it talks about, you know, businesses, cafe licenses, you know, general access to the city centre, counter-terrorism advice, which again, the point's been made, we're not privy to all that information. So I think it is a tricky area, and I'd love to say I've got some answers, but I think we all know it is difficult. But I think, yeah, we're very hopeful that actually, you know, starting with this and going forward, there can be some, you know, joint looking at those details and understanding the different viewpoints, and trying to find those compromises where we can get them.
Thank you, Andrew. For what it's worth, very much appreciate you being here. It's important that we do have, I'm not suggesting that you represent the voice of business exclusively. I'm sure you would never want that title, but it's good to have some form of representation from local businesses. So look forward to your contributions for the rest of the evening. Next on my list is Flick Williams. Flick, might you have anything to say at this point?
Yes, please, Chair.
Fire away.
Okay, good evening, everyone. I would like to start by thanking Councillor Taylor for ensuring representation by disabled people in this discussion today. I am here representing both Reverse the Ban and York Disability Rights Forum. If you are wondering why public participation wasn't filled with disabled people advocating for our human rights, I think it's pertinent to say that as we are now in our 4th year of this situation, everyone is exhausted with constantly showing up and making the same arguments repeatedly. It's soul destroying on top of the daily barriers to participation, constantly challenging the ableism we experience, and indeed staying alive in a cost of greed crisis with a crumbling health service. But the May elections installed a Labour administration with a clear mandate to restore access for blue badge holders. A new day has dawned, and the task of this scrutiny committee is to make recommendations to the executive as to the way forward. At the heart of the matter is the reconciliation of security services counter-terror advice and the human rights of disabled people. This was the subject of an award-winning independent postgraduate piece of academic research by human rights law and practice students at the University of York. It's disappointing not to see this referenced in the report before you, and thank the Chair for agreeing to its inclusion in the report that goes before Executive. It found that the test of proportionality had not been met. So getting to the meat of the officer report before you, I find it wanting. There is a distinct lack of clarity between options 1 and 3, and the option of doing nothing, not logically option 2. Transparency, not obfuscation, is required. Option 1 is troubling. Mention of it taking significant time to implement and incurring additional capital costs of around £2 million appears heavily weighted against not doing it. As we have not yet embarked on any consultation as to how we might do it, this figure feels very much plucked from the air. Against a backdrop of very apparent financial difficulties for this authority, it plays directly to those who will argue it cannot be afforded. But if we can afford 4.3 million to do the HVM scheme, we must afford the additional cost to finish it in a way that makes the city accessible to all. The last sentence of paragraph 20 is frankly offensive. None of the construction works would be having the greatest impact on disabled people had they been properly planned and executed. The chaos when works began in both High Petergate and Lendal were directly added to by adjacent businesses, only corrected when I threatened legal action. And the Spurriergate scheme started without realistic planning for pedestrian safety. Seems we are only concerned about disabled people when it suits the narrative. Before the results of the consultation part 1 are fully analysed, it is important to note that equalities is not a numbers game. There will always be people, including some disabled people, who would prefer no vehicles at all. But a preference is a nice to have, not something that prevents inclusion. The goal must surely be no one left behind. This is analogous with the recent debate on 2 wheelchair spaces on buses. We can't have them because people don't like flip down seats or want more legroom. But you don't get preferences at the cost of wheelchair users constantly left behind at bus stops, not equality. And as for the threat posed by vehicles in the foot streets, what of the stream of delivery vehicles currently there that shouldn't be? The refuse collection vehicles where the lone worker leaves the vehicle with cab door open and engine running whilst rubbish is loaded into the rear of the vehicle. It seems to me that throughout we've been very selective as to which security advice we follow and which we ignore. Similarly, counter-terror consultant Sean Tunstall was also here in August 22 and told us pavement cafes significantly increased the threat of an attack. Why then is Fossgate still full of them with no protection from vehicles at either end? And the city's bridges so packed with pedestrians they spill into the road at weekends with no protection. No coherence, no consistency. Perhaps the title of the new draft legislation gives us a clue. The Terrorism, open brackets, Protection of Premises, close brackets, bill. Paragraphs 35, 38 and 48 are repetitious. From reading this report, anyone might conclude that pavement cafe owners have a protected characteristic. No mention of the purple and grey pounds lost to all businesses in the city since 2020. In conclusion, it is not for me to suggest how we should do it, purely to advocate for why we must do it and readmit blue badge holders to the city centre, allowing them to access all the amenities it has to offer. I'll end by quoting from the conclusions reached by academic research. It says, City of York Council has not only painted disabled people as a hindrance, but also as a risk to the safety and security of others. The rights of disabled people and counter-terror initiatives can be reconciled. However, CYC's approach has been an unbalanced one that affords disproportionate weight to the right to life based on an overinflated perception of the terror threat and an undervalued consideration of the adverse impact on blue badge holders. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for that contribution, Flick. I'm sure we'll hear more from you as the evening progresses. I should say, very brief point of clarification, I haven't agreed to include anything in an executive report. I have agreed to certainly put that recommendation forward. It's for the executive members to decide if they want extra reports within their papers. I wouldn't dare put myself in their shoes on that, but scrutiny can always make recommendations. So that brings me to Sean and Dan. Might you want to speak individually or just or one of you as a pair, if at all?
Chair, perhaps if I could start, I have the sort of local overview and the history behind this, and Mr. Patrick will have the more overarching national view of this. I'm a counter-terrorism security advisor, fully accredited, with 15 years experience in the role. I work for the North East Counter-Terrorism Police, and I oversee counter-terrorism and protective security in York District. I'm also a member of the Protect and Prepare group, which I advise on in relation to protective security in general. That's a multi-partnership group that sits within York. For some years now, probably going back about 9 years, I've been advising the council and also private businesses on the issue of hostile vehicle mitigation, which applies to both the city centre and some outlying venues. Hostile vehicle mitigation is an effective and proven security measure for protecting crowded places and places where the public gather, such as in the centre of York. There are many examples of hostile vehicle mitigation which can be seen in other large cities and towns throughout the UK, and they put in place to protect the public from the various terrorist attack methodologies using vehicles. This includes vehicles that contain explosives, as well as everyday vehicles that can be used to drive into crowded areas and public areas. This is known as a vehicle as a weapon attack, of which there have been numerous over recent years. When considering a vehicle access scheme involving the use of security hardware, which mitigates or prevents a vehicle gaining access to the designated protected area, it's necessary to create a sterile zone free from all vehicles at times when the area is busy or crowded. Entry to such areas should be restricted to emergency response vehicles only, which can be done during the planning phase of any such scheme, such as the one that's been considered in York. I'm aware that the council have a well-developed plan and that the hardware is now being put in place. It has been subject, as far as I'm concerned, in my role as an advisor, to consultation, and has also received advice from national experts in relation to hostile vehicle mitigation and the threats that we face. To have an effective scheme in place, in my view, it would be necessary to exclude all vehicles from access to the sterile area when it's operational, which sadly would include blue badge holders. This is not something I have a personal thing against blue badge holders. I would say that it would apply to anything other than emergency vehicles. If these schemes are to be truly effective, they have to be fairly tight in terms of the rules that they have to adhere to. So that's my role. That's what I do. That's my advice. The advice I gave many years ago when I first came to York, and it's the advice that I stick to now, that if you want a hostile vehicle mitigation scheme that will reduce the risk of a terrorist attack involving a vehicle, then you have to consider excluding as many vehicles as you possibly can. And in my view, that should be kept to emergency service vehicles. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much for that. Would you like to add any more? Or?
Very briefly, Chair, if I may, thank you for the invite to this evening's meeting. I've listened with great interest to all the comments that have been made. For the purposes of those listening, I'm Dan Patrick, so I'm the Head of Protect and Prepare for Counter-Terrorism Policing in the North East and work in conjunction with Sean to my right. As a senior leader in policing, making decisions of proportionality is not something that's lost on me. However, issues of proportionality are not a decision for me to take or advise in this particular case. Clearly, our position in this debate is one of providing advice, which Sean has articulated already for the group. I've noted the feeling that people assert they are not necessarily on a level playing field, i.e. not privy to all the information. I think it's evident that in terms of the nature of what we do, that was always going to be the case. However, I would articulate that what's been in the news over recent years, not just in the UK, but on a global level, would give a baseline as to why we are suggesting hostile vehicle mitigation measures are necessary. I accept that opens a very thorny debate over how they operate and the extent to which they operate. However, that's obviously an issue for this scrutiny committee, the executive and the council themselves. Our position in this is the fewer vehicles that are allowed into crowded places, the better. Again, the most recent event probably is Nottingham. I'm sure that is in people's memories. That wasn't a terrorist incident. However, the methodology was adopted by someone else. We can't say if anything will happen in York. And if measures are in place and nothing happens, no one will ever know whether that is a good decision. The decision that needs to be wrestled with is, if the advice is not followed to its fullest extent and something does happen, how will that decision be scrutinised? I open that up purely as a means of setting the scene from our perspective, and I'm happy to answer questions as we go along, Chair, but thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Patrick and Mr. Tunstall, for those contributions. We'll open up the discussion. Obviously, committee members, there are three options that we're being asked to review. It might just be worth seeking clarity though on that from officers and maybe the relevant executive members who are with us. I think this touches on Professor Grady's question. Those sort of three options, obviously we don't know the details of the consultation results just yet, but are they definitely the three options we're looking at, obviously details pending within them, or is there any chance of a fourth option which is not like any of those?
I think, so just to clarify, the consultation, the first phase of consultation, and it was badged as a first phase, was around some principles. The proposal is that executive will make a decision in October. At the moment, that is likely to offer them those three options that are where officers have got to in terms of finding solutions. There will need to be a second period of, my expectation is, more targeted workshops to understand how we make whichever of those options is chosen work best. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive, so you could do 1 and 3, for instance, together over time if you could find the funding for it, but they are not necessarily mutually exclusive. They are the options that we've come up with as officers that we think are workable and will deliver what the new administration's council plan is, and also their obvious commitment to reviewing blue badge access.
Thank you, James. Have we any members, officers, executive members who want to ask questions now? I mean, I have a few. I don't mind starting, but equally, it's nice to mix up the voices. Councillor Nelson.
Thank you, Chair. I'm trying to figure out where to start, really. Thank you for preparing this report, which I've made lots of notes all over. So I have a few things that a few questions and a few things, comments, if that's all right. Firstly, reading this report, I was wondering whether there's maybe some scope to add some extra things in. I think that what's really interesting about this is already just in the comments that people have made, that our visitors have made to this point, there is something that was mentioned that is not covered in here at all, which is, it struck me as very, there's a lot of things in here about pavement cafes, which I wasn't in some ways expecting when we're talking about access. I appreciate that access and rights to business and the functioning of those businesses are tied together. But my understanding really is what we are scrutinising in this meeting is the right and ability for disabled people in our city and visitors to our city to access the city centre. We're not scrutinising, much as it will have an impact, which I appreciate. We're not here to scrutinise pavement cafes or pavement cafe licenses. And if we are going to kind of look at those, and I noticed, you know, they're pulled out as this will have a significant impact on pavement cafes. It says that a couple of times in the report in different places. If there's going to be points in there making that point within this public report, it feels to me that it should also be making the point this has had a significant impact on disabled people. And equally, if we're going to talk about the economics, there should be a bullet point in here about the significant impact to our economy of disabled people not being able to access the city centre to spend money. You know, there's kind of economics in here, but two people separately have mentioned the purple pound. And yet this report doesn't talk about that at all. So it just feels like there's something there that isn't balanced. Possibly isn't the real purpose of what we're here to scrutinise in the first place. So that was just kind of a key comment that stood out to me initially. In terms of questions, so there's a few places in here where it says we're sort of out looking for updated risk assessments for counter-terror. We're waiting for various bits of kind of additional consultation, and it just seems that it's quite hard to scrutinise some of the recommendations when we don't have that information yet. So I suppose I was wondering, have we asked for that consultation? When are we expecting to hear back about kind of updated counter-terror advice, for example, which it says in this report? I'm guessing that might be why you gentlemen are here as well. But yeah, just a few questions about where some of the things within this came. I know Flick mentioned the £2 million. That seemed like a number to me that has just appeared. I'd be really interested to know where that's come from, as opposed to, of course, you've mentioned a cost implication for manning Blake Street and Gudrun Gate, but there's no figure in this report. So there's a figure for one thing that doesn't tell us what the figure is, and there's no figure for another thing where we probably could have an idea of what it is. So I'm going to stop talking there and leave it there, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Nelson. Councillor Fenton, is that supplementary? Okay, you hang fire, all right? Get your name down here. James, did you want to respond to Councillor Nelson? Or?
So yeah, the counter-terrorism advice is partly about today and why these gentlemen are here. So that's addresses that point, I think. I mean, I do think we talk about the lived experience and the significant impact on disabled people. We can make sure that's adequately reflected in the exec report, but I certainly think para 2 sort of opens with that lived experience and the significant impact. We can certainly add something around the purple pound and the economy. The pavement cafes point was trying to pick up the fact that it's intrinsically linked to the decisions that got us to where we're at today as well, to a certain extent. So the original proliferation of pavement cafes, the change in rules, which has reduced the number of pavement cafes. And the consequence of this decision is that if you permit blue badge holders access, presumably they will want to park, that will impact on blue badge holders. So it's not a protected characteristic point, it's just a point that there is an impact. And I think I was trying to explain the potential impacts in doing that. If that's overstated, then I apologise.
Chair, if I may, just on that, I mean, it is important that we understand the history of the decision and how we got here, because, you know, the blue badge ban did start with COVID, and then it was extended to allow for pavement cafes. You know, counter-terrorism came a little bit later into the decision making of this authority, not from the counter-terrorism people. They've been banging on about it for years, but the decision making process originally started off with COVID, then pavement cafes, and then it became counter-terrorism. And I think that's that's why it's in the report. But I take the point about pavement cafes not having protected characteristics.
Thank you, Councillor Kilbane. James?
I'm just going to come back on the consultation. So we consulted on 5 principles, which generally got significant support. The only point where there was, I think it was around about 60% support, which is the lowest of the support levels, was around the blue badge ban during the Christmas market. And that was one that was less well supported of the principles we consulted upon. We're going through those detailed comments at the moment so that we can summarise those for the exec report.
Thank you. Councillor Healy, is this a supplementary?
It certainly is.
Okay.
I'm forgetting to do that. You may not be able to do it when you bring this back to the exec report, but you might want to ask the economic analysis team to sort of broaden it out a bit more than 16 cafes, X number of disabled people per £1 into a sort of more rounded economic analysis.
We can certainly ask the question on that. I'm no issue with seeking their input. The point I didn't come back to, apologies, Councillor Nelson, was about the cost. So the £2 million, as the report details, the original HVM scheme, which goes back to 2018, was a relatively tight area covering Piccadilly and Coney Street primarily. As Councillor Kilbane rightly identifies, that then grew during COVID, with pavement cafes to a bigger footprint, as detailed in the maps in the report. So that's why we've got a pretty good idea of what it will cost to put two measures back in that onion skinner coach, because that was originally where the scheme was. So that's where the £2 million comes from. It hasn't been out to the market for several years, so it's a rounded best guess, not least because it would be delivered as a separate measure. In terms of the cost for staffing the entry points, we're working through those costs at the moment. They are rough at the moment, but you are talking circa £200,000 per annum probably to staff those two entry points for pedestrianised hours. 7 days a week, obviously.
Thank you, James. Mr. Mitchell, is this a supplementary? Yeah, fire away then.
It's just regarding the staffing at Blake Street. And I'm wondering, is that going to be a permanent fixture, or are you looking for other technologies that can fulfill that role? Because it certainly wouldn't run at £200,000 circa, or circa £200,000 every year if you've got technology in place.
No, and as I think is alluded to, in this second round of engagement, we will need to work with blue badge holders to understand if there is a better, smarter way that works for them and is cheaper, that facilitates access. In terms of trying to get access quickly, the best solution, I think, is a staff presence in the short term. If we can find a better solution, then obviously we would be keen to explore that through those engagement workshops.
Thank you. Councillor Rowley, supplementary.
It is, Chair, yeah, and forgive me, I've observed these bollards being installed, and there seems to be some way on the bollards of communicating with somebody. And it even looks like there's a swipe thing for a swipe card, and maybe go back to the technology that was alluded to a minute ago. Were these installed with a view to having that technology available to us, so that people that have got an access card can either swipe it or, or even speak to somebody at a central location?
I'm in danger of extending my area of expertise now, but my understanding is they don't have a swipe card system, but there is an intercom arrangement with a control centre. The problem with that, because of the tight nature of some of our streets, that may require you to leave the vehicle. Now, for a blue badge holder, that is obviously potentially a significant inconvenience, which is why I'm not necessarily proposing here these are solutions that will work. I think that's exactly why we need to do these workshops and engagement to understand what would and wouldn't work.
Thank you. I'm going to come to Councillor Fenton, who's been very patient with a new question.
So I'll start with a.
Oh, forgive me. Was that a follow-up to the previous answer?
It was just, to reiterate, or not reiterate, but just provide some thought around the technology issue that's been introduced. Of course, we live in a world of technology which has many great advances, but with each advance, there's also an equal and opposite danger. And I would suggest that unless there's absolute confidence in the control of blue badge fraud, that will need to be guarded against using technological measures to safeguard against the actual relaxation of mitigation measures. I'm not saying we shouldn't consider it. I say we, it's not my consideration. It's not something that you should consider. But of course, we do know that unfortunately blue badges are used fraudulently. That is to the detriment of those who need them. and obviously to the detriment and the I suppose the difficulties around setting policy regards this. But if we resort to a technological solution at those access points, that potentially increases the danger of the mitigations failing. Just wanted to raise that point for consideration.
Yeah, thank you. It's probably worth adding as well that there might be some blue badge holders who might struggle to use whatever that technology is. Like, we shouldn't assume that swiping is an easy task, you know.
Absolutely. I think, again, technology itself becomes divisive in terms of the Equality Act and things with it, but it's certainly worthy of consideration by the group and the executive. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Fenton, thanks for your patience.
No, that's fine. Just one clarification and then a question, if I may. So it's been suggested that this all started during COVID. So looking on page 30 of the background papers, I think it was 2018 when discussions were first had around hostile vehicle mitigation measures, and there's a letter in August 2018 from North Yorkshire Police. So I think, and James will correct me if I'm wrong, that the intention always was for a phased approach to this. Is that, have I recalled correctly?
So that's correct, without going into all the reports. So the original proposal, as I said just now, was to protect primarily Parliament Street and Coney Street as a core area, with a second phase to follow with an onion skin type approach, so that you may deploy the core area every day, say, and only deploy the outer area at Christmas markets, say, as a significant football event. That was the way forward until COVID came along, and then it was during COVID that blue badge holders were excluded initially to allow queuing on streets. As you'll remember, only so many people allowed in the premises at a time, so blue badge holders were removed, stopped from parking on those streets so that queuing could happen on those streets. And then through economic recovery and eat out to help out and all those sorts of things, pavement cafes and the deregulated approach from the government came along, so it remained. The decision taken in November 21 was in effect to say we want to keep that pavement cafe culture in a larger area than the core area. And at that point, it was decided to move the HVM because the activity and the crowded nature of extending that beyond that core area. And the intention was for that to run till 7:30, 8 o'clock time, I think, of an evening from memory. Also changed that risk profile, which was why that extended area was to be protected. Obviously, those things have now changed in that the pavement cafes are reduced from what they were in November 21. And to date, there hasn't been a decision to extend Foot Street hours.
So I just thought that was helpful. A question around the scope of option 3. As one of the public speakers referred to potential overlap or confusion between options 1 and 3. So paragraph 28 on page 19 talks about 2 entry points, Blake Street and Lendal. Should that be Blake Street and Goodram Gate? Because Blake Street and Lendal is...
Yeah, apologies, yes, it should be.
Yeah. That's fine, I just wanted to be clear.
No, you're absolutely correct.
So my reading of option 3 is that rather than having a sort of an inner core and an outer core as option 1 would create, you would have one level of protection, which would be the outer ring. And then under option 3, there would be access for vehicles that were permitted to enter that secure ring. They would have access at all times to all streets. So in terms of Parliament Street, Coney Street, so the streets that pre the additional restrictions being introduced, there were already restrictions on blue badge access to those streets. So would option 3 in effect allow all access to all streets, or would it?
No, option 3 is to reinstate the previous access that had existed prior to 2019. So that is the entry via Blake Street through St Helens Square and out through Lendal, and then coming down Goodrum Gate and out through Collier Gate from memory. So it would recreate the access that had existed immediately prior to COVID.
It might be worth in the final iteration of this report making that a bit clearer. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Fenton. I'll come to Councillor Healy if it's a supplementary.
No, it's not.
Okay, yeah, you bottom of the queue then. I see, yeah. Supplementary, Councillor Burton.
Just wondered, hearing about all this.
Microphone, sorry, Jane.
I'm just wondering, when were these sliding bollards, HVM measures, when were they ordered in the history of all of this? Because I know in the Martin Higgett report, he proposed a route through the city. That was a report that City of York Council commissioned, and he gave a way through that maybe wasn't as good as it had been before, but there was a way through. And I know Chester has a way of admitting disabled people and yet protecting the security of other citizens. So I'm just thinking other places have been very inclusive, as inclusive as possible. Even Leeds, you can get to the side streets of Briggate very easily and park because there are blue badge spaces there, although I think it's still heavily protected. Why is it that York has decided to go for this big area, the largest, I think, pedestrian area it would be in the country if it stays as it is? And when the bollards were actually ordered in this format?
So the HVM measures have been under design for a long time. I cannot give you an absolutely definitive answer of when they were ordered, but it was post the November 21 decision that froze that larger area. So we were doing design work, and from memory, executive gave us an option to do some design work and spend some money at cost, potentially abortive cost before November 21, so that we'd got options on the table. So the order would have gone in after that November 21 for the final measures. In terms of the other cities point, you are correct in that some cities have chosen to create routes through their city to a certain extent. So Chester's model has more HVM bollards in it because it protects those streets that have come through the geography. Obviously, that's relatively a solution that they found. At the moment, it was the impact of all those bollards within the city centre needs to be balanced up against the access. And obviously, you know, the decision made in November 21 was to go for that bigger area. If the decision in November 21 had been to retain that smaller area, you would still have had blue badge access through Blake Street, St Helens Square and Lendal and Goodrum Gate and Collier Gate, obviously.
Because the pavement cafe situation seems to have escalated the amount of bollards needed. And I'm just thinking about the cost risk analysis and how much the council actually gets back from businesses and the cafes in terms of business rates and tax. I don't know whether, because I know that the cost of the bollards has risen from 1.7, 3.5 and now to 4.2 to 4.3 million, because when they were actually ordered, they weren't assessed in the sense that they weren't even allowing double buggies to get in when they were open along the side of the bollards. So I'm not really technically minded, but if you see what I mean. So there's been, seems a bit rushed to me as a layperson.
I think the design is difficult. So there is a maximum distance they can be apart as a security bollard. So the security advisors would tell us that they can only be so far apart before they become ineffective and not compliant in effect. Where you are working on narrow pavements, that creates a particular problem because you've got a pavement edge and a a curb edge, which we also need to protect, because obviously a terrorist will use the pavement if we've just protected the carriageway. I think I'd challenge whether it's rushed. We've been bringing reports on this since 2017. I think the problem of COVID changed the design process during that process. So it's evolved through several iterations through the process. But I think we did have a problem with a communication device in one location, whether that's what you're referring to.
I think that's in several, actually, but yeah.
I've had an indication from Councillor Kilbane to jump in on this.
Yeah, and it just, it may just help with the context for this discussion as well, that what we are dealing with the situation that we inherited, and we are trying to make the best of, the bollards as ordered are going in. They are causing chaos across the city as they're going in. Well, a lot of disruption anyway, maybe not chaos, but a lot of disruption across the city. And, we want to get to a place where the work's done and we have, we think from everything that we're hearing, blue badge access back into the city to some degree. And then hopefully we can have a city that starts to be a bit more at peace with itself. But it's very important to say that this is just the first step, and that access to the city centre will also be looked at as part of the local transport plan. We need to think about how we access and move around the city, and that we do have ambition for the city. We might not have any cash, but we've got ambition and we'll go looking for the cash. So, this is not the end of the story. This is a way of trying to make sure that people can access our city as quickly as we can, as safely as we can, with all due diligence, following on from the May election.
Thank you, Councillor Kilbane. I have a queue of hands, including those remote, but Councillor Healy, you had a supplementary before. You might. Fair enough. Oh, forgive me. Okay, well, in that case, next I've got Councillor Hook.
Thank you, Chair. I remember I was on that steep road in Clovelly when I got a phone call. Have you got any ideas of things for a disabled person like your mother, so that it was she could access the city better? And I said seats and buses to get nearer to the city. So, and I know that there was an action plan developed, and one of those things was more seats, a circular bus that went round and things like that. So we were just wondering, I was just wondering whether there's any more, the action plan that's been developed, what state that's in, and are these mitigation methods going to go in?
So we've done several updates to scrutiny. I think we've done an update to this scrutiny indeed on that very action plan previously. There is, and David may want to come in, but there is a trial of benches happening on Acomb Front Street imminently, if not already, which will inform the measures that then go into the city centre. So there is work on that action plan. I think there will be some decisions for executive to make, depending which option they go with, to then go back and review that action plan in light of the decision they make. So depending on what the decision is, do those mitigations still work? Do they need to be changed for a different mitigation? As Councillor Kilbane has talked about, it's a first step. So what does further mitigations or improvements look like in terms of next steps? That may mean some new things. It may mean some things we had planned don't happen. But I think that's considering it in the round.
Supplementary, Councillor Nelson, and I'll come to you. Oh, forgive me.
Sorry, do you want me to just give a further update to what James has just said? Is that right?
Yeah, fire away.
Okay, so there was a number of strategies in the action plan. The first one James has alluded to, which was identifying what we would consider to be an acceptable, accessible seating strategy. That's been concluded through an external provider called MEMA, with a number of members of the public and the Access Forum feeding into that. When I first started in November last year, this came on our desk at exactly the same time as we reviewed the plans for Acomb Front Street, and I won't talk about the bollard. But we had an opportunity, it's not quite the city centre, but we had the opportunity to identify and develop 2 new types of seating whilst amending the existing seating at Acomb Front Street to give us 3 options, whether purchase 2 new ones or adjust what we already have in the city centre. We have an open trial of that tomorrow up at Acomb. Members of the York Actors Forum and the York Older Persons Assembly have been invited between 10 and 12:30, so we're praying for good weather. We have drafted up a very simple questionnaire to get the views on the preferences of them and any resident could be found in Acomb at the same time. So that's the first thing. The second thing is one of the other, it wasn't on the action plan, but it was an additional access strategy, was around gold standard car parks. This was done in 2 phases, again with members of the disabled community, to identify what would make a gold standard car park in York, where we identified the facilities that a gold standard car park would need. A survey was then done of the 7 major car parks in the city centre, and 2 were identified as being the best places to implement those requirements. There was also the development nationally of a new standard called Park Mark, which goes beyond what we currently have in our people's car park standard. So now that's being developed again with one of our officers who sits on the national committee and has been down there in London today. So we're looking to bring those 2 together. We've also worked with Travel York and Wheels for Wellbeing on developing accessible cycle stands. We're one of the first councils in the country to install a trial, and again we've been able to do that as part of the works at Acomb Front Street. We're just finalising citywide signage and wayfinding for the few changing places that we currently have from the 6 major car parks in the city centre. We finalised the route maps, the signage for the car parks themselves, and the signs that you will see being dotted around the city centre once that's all been installed. We've been working on identifying where we can make improvements to it. I won't go into this, but there's quite a lot going on. And we are very grateful from our perspective, to the disabled community, because there's been so much happening in such a short period of time because of where we are today as opposed to where we were. We are asking a lot of our volunteers and our communities in respect to engagement and getting their thoughts and feelings on how we can do things better. And whereas there are lessons to be learned from BB, what we call internally BB1, Blue Beige Phase 1, there is a genuine desire to want to engage properly with our community and rebuild that trust and that relationship. And we're hoping that all these little strategies that we're doing are going to be working towards that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, David. If we need of any materials for these benches and cycle stands, we could always melt some of those bollards in Acomb down. I do have supplementaries. If I've got you wrong or I've put you down as a main question, just shout out. Councillor Pearson, and then supplementary Councillor Burton, Councillor Nelson. Okay.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, and thanks everyone for all the interesting contributions this evening. It's a difficult debate to have. It was a supplementary really around the action plan, because I think that's really, really important, because regardless of the decisions going forward, I felt that some of the things that were mentioned in the action plan actually opened up access and inclusion to parts of the city centre that perhaps weren't accessible, even regardless of the closure of Blake Street, Lendal and Goodram Gate. So I actually think that's a really good thing that we need to keep a close eye on. So I'd like to see that come back to this committee at a later date, if that's all right.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Pearson. Forgive me, I had Professor Grady and Flick down as having new questions, but I think they're supplementaries and they've been in the queue for a while. So I'll jump to them and come back to you guys if that's all right. Professor Grady, thank you for waiting.
I think Flick's hand was up first, so perhaps she should go
Okay.
first.
Cool, thank you. Flick?
Thank you, Chair. So coming back on the issue of the fraudulent use of blue badges and the stray into a conversation around the technology, which I thought we were avoiding this evening and sticking to principles. But when we experienced problems with the first installations of the HVM with regard to disabled pedestrians, I then sought out guidance on government guidance on HVM installations, which actually was quite illuminating, really, because it said to have a central control centre operating HVM barriers actually poses an additional element of risk, which it allows a would-be terrorist to actually take control of the whole city centre from one location. So I just make that general point because there is, you know, risk to all of this, and it seems that once again it's being presented as, you know, very one-sided. In terms of the technology generally, there are all sorts of issues. The previous administration, when they ordered the HVM installations, obviously had no intention of readmitting blue badge holders, so they currently do not have the necessary technology to allow blue badge holders to be admitted. Effectively, there are problems using a solely technological method of doing so, because you can have registrations linked to blue badges, which of course disadvantages non-blue badge holder drivers, you know, disproportionately. But of course, there's no way that ANPR technology or similar can actually identify whether the blue badge holder is actually in the vehicle. So there is that. With respect to all the very good work of the access officer, I'm not quite sure how accessible cycle stands when cycling, even for disabled cyclists, is still forbidden in the foot streets area, and car parks, they can be platinum standard, but the reality is they are all too far away for many disabled people. There is a danger in this discussion of having a very homogenized view of what disabled people need. Our diversity across different impairments and across different, you know, needs is vast, and I would ask that we don't lose sight of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Flick. I think that's all your points make a very reasonable and challenge and a fair nudge to the committee. I think it's probably worth stressing that we should try and anchor this discussion on principles, otherwise we'll be here all night. I mean, I'm happy to stay here all night, frankly. I've got nothing better to do. But I do have a life outside of this committee. But yeah, let's keep it on key principles, otherwise we'll get bogged down in granular details, which the council and the executive will be getting onto in future months as this sort of work progresses. That said, I've got supplementaries waiting. Councillor Burton.
Very briefly, I think it's great to have benches, but it's not if you can't get to them in the first place. So not much use if you can't. I can't personally get to these places in the centre of town. I know 3,000 people nearly signed the petition, reverse the ban, and the close to us petition is 2,000. In the report, it says some disabled people. I say that's quite a significant amount of disabled people who are really not happy about the situation. Car parks and Guild Standard, I think the MEMA report suggested Bootham and the Castle car park as places that were Guild Standard and not the current one, which is Coppergate, I think, Piccadilly. So again, beware on that, because St. George, Castlegate car park is due for closure. in the scheme of things. And that's a place where there is some relative happiness with that car park for disabled people.
Thank you, Councillor Burton. Councillor Kilburn, I need to go back to Professor Grady, but go on.
Just, it might be helpful in terms of getting into the granular detail. These are all issues really for the local transport plan, because the local transport plan does include walking and wheeling. And so how you move yourself across the city centre is a big part of that. So, you know, all these things can be fed into that consultation.
Yeah, thank you. It's a good point. Professor Grady, thanks for waiting.
Thanks. Just a couple of quick points. I want to go back to a comment that the police superintendent, I think, finished their input on, which was a question really to the council around how the council would respond if blue badge access was allowed and there was a bomb attack. It feels to me that this is an unhelpful way of kind of progressing this discussion, because you could equally ask, how is the council going to respond if blue badge access is not allowed and there's a study in 5 or 10 years time on the damaging, even devastating effect the exclusion has had on disabled people in the city. I think we need to try and move towards a position where we kind of collectively own whatever decision is made in the city and acknowledge how challenging and difficult balancing the rights principles are on this issue. That's the first thing. I guess the second one is really just to say that it does feel to me that, given all the discussion around co-production in the city, that it's a pity that it seems as though 3 options are going to be presented in the consultation as to some extent predetermined. I do worry that if that is indeed the route that's being proposed, that is going to affect both the quality and quantity of engagement with this, because my sense is that people are tired of consultation on those kinds of terms, and that something that is more genuinely co-produced would be much more productive. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Grady. I have supplementaries waiting. Councillor Ben Burton and Councillor Whitcroft, is that? Okay, I'll come back to you, Ben. Councillor Nelson and then Whitcroft. Is that all right? Oh, okay. Councillor Nelson.
Thanks, Chair. Just to come back to the discussion around the action plan and the kind of update that the access officer gave us, it's really great that these sort of little different things are happening around the city to improve access to the city. But the distance that you must not be able to safely walk to get a blue badge is 50 metres. And I just thought it was really important that we remember that. The distance from Blake Street, Ask Italian to St Sampson Square is 322 metres. And that's the case in our city centre from every direction that we're talking about. So it would be lovely to have a bus that goes round and round in circles around the city centre. It's really important that we have accessible seating and things like that all the way through the city centre, but none of that actually helps the issue at hand, which is that nowhere in the city centre is within 50 metres of kind of the closest disabled parking spaces at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Nelson. We have a hand from Superintendent Patrick.
It was just really in response to Press's sort of statement and questions, really, and I'm grateful for the challenge and not wanting to be misrepresented. I posed that rhetorical question in the context of we will always be judged by our decisions, by our future members of the public. It's clearly going to be a very difficult and divisive decision to make for those involved. And from our perspective, of course, our advice stands by virtue of our experience, but I do understand everything, and it's not lost on me the challenges presented to our disabled communities. And again, listening to Councillor Nelson there talk about that distance, clearly it's going to be difficult to allow vehicles to within 50 metres of anywhere. So that will persist as a problem, regardless of where the measures are placed. So I just wanted to thank the Professor for the challenge and obviously clarify my remark in that sense.
Thank you for that. We'll move on to fresh questions. I've got Councillor Ben Burton.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. It's just in option 3, there is a lot of
information about the anti-terrorism traffic regulation order, or the excitingly named ATRO. Can we have a bit more? It seems quite integral to option 3, given the amount of time that's given over to it, and I suspect it's going to be a big part of the strategy if it's implemented. It's a question for yourself, but also probably police colleagues to tie in. Do you have some detail about how that's maybe being thought about being implemented with option 3 and what that would look like, please?
So in effect, it's the normal process of creating traffic regulation order is you advertise it, you consult on it, and then you implement it. The difference with a anti-terror TRO is you advertise and you consult on it, and it sits there as a measure to be deployed if you need it. So to a certain extent, I suppose the most recent example was we actually used an anti-terror traffic regulation order when the now King came to the Minster. So they are relatively new piece of legislation in the transport toolkit to allow you to sort of manage the highway from a terrorism perspective. The way I see it working in this instance is that we would, if the police supported it, and it's the only TRO that does require police support, if the police supported it, we would develop that counter-terrorism TRO, but that would allow them, for instance, to keep the measures, the HVM measures, in place for longer if there was a significant event, or if there was a protest in the city about something and that became a police insecurity risk. It might be that actually we can say, do you know what, we'll go into a more extreme lockdown situation and there will be nobody allowed in. I don't know whether you want to sort of add anything on that, but.
No, I think it was quite eloquently done there, James. Realistically, it filled a gap in the legislation. You couldn't close roads for certain reasons beyond kind of heritage and a few other particular exemptions. And this filled a gap so that when the chief constable of a police force area recommends that it may be a requirement to shut down that highway, that there's an order that's available to do it in response to counter-terror measures. I think what James is trying to say is you can have one running almost permanently and switch it on and off. That's the kind of mechanism in play with delegation for decision making to, essentially it was the Office of Constable initially, but that can be delegated further to members of the council, as I understand it. Forgive me, I'm at the extent of my knowledge there.
Okay, so I was going to ask about that. So this ATTRO, I was thinking, well, who asks for this and what's the threshold? So is it a very high threshold, or for argument's sake, we're having a special market event in the city centre at a certain time in the year?
So the way you should use the anti-terror traffic regulation order, in my view, and I'm not an expert and would need the legal advice to sit around this, is that we'd use it based on the intelligence that might be received at relatively short notice. The way I would approach events and things is through the safety advisory group, which counter-terrorism policing sit on and advise on. So when we are taking events through that group that are planned and go through that process, we'd use that to consider those impacts and whether we needed to trigger some sort of different arrangement to what's currently happening. In a way, that's no, as I say, no different to what used to happen prior to all of this. So going back to 2015, 2016, through that process, we said, actually, do you know what? The Christmas markets make the city so busy. We are going to extend Foot Street hours until 7:30 on Fridays and Saturdays to keep people safe. So that sort of arrangement has always existed.
Thank you, James. Councillor Whitcroft.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I was also going to ask about the ATTROs. My thunder has been completely stolen by both Councillor Byrne and yourself, Chair. But I did just want to ask about the governance situation. The idea of a permanent anti-terror order being in place, I think would raise concerns with any of us to make sure what the definition for in paragraph 26 sound reasons were. What kind of governance would be in place? What kind of recourse would members of the council have to review that particular view, and are there examples of permanent ATTROs in place across the country? Is this something that is made a permanent order, or is it expected to be brought in temporarily? I'd just like a bit more clarity about the governance and how we can ensure that this is properly scrutinised.
So the creation of the anti-terror traffic regulation order would be a decision made by members. So normal traffic regulation orders, normally, I think, apart from the emergency ones or some of the very routine ones, are all made at decision session, normally Councillor Cobain's decision session. This is so significant that it might end up going to executive, but it would be a member decision if we were to create an anti-terror traffic regulation order. There does need to be consultation on it, and as I say, it needs the recommendation of the chief of the police to create it. Some of them are temporary, so the one that we had when now King attended was a short-term one for a specific event. The proposal is that this would be a long-term one sitting there so that the police, if they were aware of significant intelligence, could trigger it. I think there is the option within the wording to make sure that that trigger we can make sure is a senior police officer rather than just anybody. But again, we need to work through the absolute detail of that.
Thank you. Councillor Rowley, I must apologise. I'm going to roll back a little bit. You had a supplementary before.
Yeah, so I was probably being a little bit premature there. I've got comments generally for the discussion as opposed to a question, so I'll reserve it for then.
Well, you can do that now if you like. I've got no other hands waiting.
So if we are at the general discussion stage, so when the threat of terrorism, I respect the superintendent's comments. So the terrorist threat is a dynamic threat. You know, we see it when it's at a very high level, and there are times when it's at a very low level. And therefore mitigation has to be proportionate. We can all recall visits in our school days to Hadrian's Wall, and that was a measure that was put in place to mitigate being invaded by the Scots. And the very city walls that we have and are proud of were put in place as mitigation to, prevent untowards entering the city. I can remember in my days as a soldier serving in the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And in those days in Northern Ireland, you entered the city centre through turnstiles. So there were metal fencing all around the city centre, and you entered through a turnstile, and everything was searched and what have you. I was in Belfast recently, and it's a wonderful, beautiful city. The terrorist threat is still there, but obviously the response is proportionate. And I think that when you take advice, as we have to, from the professional advisors, which is very important in the round, we just have to be proportionate about our response. And part of that proportionality has to understand the fact that we have a city that is dynamic. We have a city that requires access. I read in the report a couple of places where comments such as in paragraph 22, it talks about the risk of vehicles, of allowing disabled vehicles into the city. The risk is that the vehicle within the secure zone can be commandeered and used as a weapon anywhere in the secure zone by those determined to do so. I would probably say to you that any vehicle, irrespective of whether it was a disabled vehicle or not, can be commandeered. And I think if there's a determination to commit an act of terrorism, the fact that there isn't a vehicle to do it will not deter the terrorist from that. So I think that as far as moving forward is concerned, again, I just want to just challenge Andrew's point about the politicisation of the blue badge. We are politicians and we campaign on those issues that are important to the residents of this city. So I make no apology of including it in our manifesto, as I know the Labour group don't make any apology for including it in theirs. It is a very important issue that needs to be aired and not politicised. So I would recommend that we continue to look at ways of including those that are disabled. I think probably, in my perception and that of my group, is that we've probably taken a bit of a sledgehammer to crack a nut in terms of what we've done. And we've also tied ourselves into knots in that to undo that is going to be costly. So again, a lot of thought around how we do that. But I certainly stand by our position as a group to see this ban reversed and disabled drivers given access to the city centre. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Councillor Rowley. I've got your suggested recommendation down. Councillor Healy, I apologise. I've had a lot of names to juggle this evening.
Thank you, Chair. I'll make this quick as I'm going to have to leave you early. First a point and then a couple of questions. I was surprised on page 20 on the background that you started in 2018. I recollect between 2011 and 2015, the previous Labour administration brought this topic forward to close the city centre to Blues badge holders. And in that time, it was primarily on economic reasons. So if you could pull those papers out and add them to the report to the executive, I think it might be helpful. I haven't found it, but I'll keep looking. The then Labour leader made a very eloquent speech comparing York City Centre to Meadow Hall. So I'd recommend viewing that. But circumstances change. So I'm just trying to put the point is this is not a bad Lib Dem Green decision to impose this upon Blue badge holders. People change their minds, and that's obviously happened. So just to make that point to inform me.
Well, if we're making things clear, have the Lib Dems changed their mind now?
Yeah, they did.
Okay.
It went from Labour proposing it in 11 to 15. I believe the Tories opposed it at the time and the Lib Dems opposed it. Time moved on. I think the terrorist threat moved up.
So what's your position at this moment in time? Just so we're all, aware and have clarity.
My position is,
Yeah. Parties, if we're mentioning all of that.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I didn't know I was under question. Personally, I don't feel that without the behind closed doors briefing by the national agencies, any of us here can accurately weigh up the local decision that's been articulated very well by many members of the lived experience of the disabled community against the very low risk of a national threat. And picking up the point that was made by Andrew, this has now become political. It's been added to a manifesto. You make commitments in manifestos and you look to deliver those commitments. But as politicians, this debate, if we'd gone back 8 years ago, would have been very good to have, because from a political perspective, you are weighing up the everyday lived experience of the disabled community against the counter-terrorism threat, which I'm guessing the nightmare for the police is that a lone wolf, in quotes, makes an IED out of perfectly available materials, rents a truck, drives it in the city centre and detonates it. Now, the likelihood of that happening is incredibly low, but that's the risk at one end of the spectrum, your sort of your black swan scenario, against at the other end, the access requirements for the city centre. So I don't envy the executive having to make this decision, having to make that choice. And I haven't had that briefing. I've been told in the round from people that have, but I would just ask, as there is a section here where it says the executives are being briefed in private by counter-terrorism policing in advance of any decision. Don't make your mind up until you have that.
That briefing happened today.
That briefing happened today. So that post-dated a manifesto commitment, which you're now committed to join. And picking up Andrew's point, it does feel like a done deal.
Thank you.
And that's my point.
Thank you, councillor Healy. Councillor Lomas, you put your hand up midway through that, and I'll come to the other hands.
It's not supplementary to that, so I had my hand up before.
Oh,
So-
did you? Okay, well,
so it's-
I'll come back to you
Yeah.
shortly then, if I may. Councillor Pearson?
Thanks, Chair. I just wanted to clarify that the Lib Dem position is as per our own manifesto, which was to keep the operation of a city centre access arrangements under review once hostile vehicle measures recommended by police and terrorism experts to protect all in the city centre have been installed, ensuring the most up-to-date police advice is followed and all alternatives and mitigations are explored. Now, it sounds like Councillor Kilbane has had that briefing and it's probably confidential what he's heard. And so he's going to have to weigh that up himself, as is the rest of the executive.
Indeed. I mean, I should say, you know, despite our party political differences, I think those contributions are actually helpful, because one thing I was going to get onto when trying to sum up tonight is that I think the debate between access versus security is a completely legit one to have. But one thing to try and shift this forward is that one thing I don't think, if we really care about equalities and not discriminating against residents, the debate which is access versus private commercial interests of a relatively small number of pavement cafes, I think that shouldn't even be on the table, in my personal view. And we will progress this discussion if we keep it on those totally dominant matters of key principle, access and security / right to life, as has been worded in this document. I think that might illustrate some degree of progress. But I had a hand, Superintendent Patrick. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. It was just really to follow on from Councillor's comments, insofar as it sounds like I'm speaking the obvious here, but clearly terror attacks take many forms, whether that's individual or sophisticated or highly organised ones. We've all seen the lone wolf attacks, as has previously been described, with knives. Clearly, these measures that we're discussing today won't safeguard against those that choose to conduct that type of attack. However, in terms of kind of security and mitigation, a vehicle-borne attack is far more damaging in terms of size, scale, and potential injury than single-person attacks. And I think this is the position. I think a comment I've heard previously is you could close down an entire city centre because you could mitigate the threat to everyone in there, but that obviously stifles all economic activity and enjoyment of that particular place. So I think whilst we are discussing these issues, you're quite right to say the chances of an attack like that happening probably are at the lower end of the scale. However, all too often, these decisions are considered after an attack has happened rather than prior to. So you're in a privileged position at this stage to be considering these issues prior to an attack actually happening, and hopefully one never does. But in the same breath, I understand that kind of access versus security issues needs to be very carefully weighed up. So it's just really to clarify the point in terms of this particular issue around vehicles represents perhaps the escalation in potential damage by virtue of that being used as a weapon, as opposed to a single issue of pedestrianised type of attack.
Thank you for that. Councillor Lomas, I think I can come to you now.
Thank you, Chair. And thanks everyone for this discussion this evening. I think it's actually been incredibly helpful, and I'm sure will be helpful to all of executive when we come to make decisions around this. I'm particularly struck by a few things that I think probably need to be highlighted more in the report. So a couple of people have mentioned the research that was done, the independent research that was done, that I don't think it might be linked deep within some of the links that are attached to the report, but I think is quite instructive for anyone that's read it. And certainly I think that'll be helpful to highlight. The Martin Higgett report, again, I know it's probably attached to some of the papers that are linked to in the report, but that also I think is quite instructive in addressing that question of how do we balance the safety and security aspects versus access, and what options might be open to us now or in the future for improving access in the city centre while having that safety and security in mind. It also struck me when I was trying desperately to work out which street was which in the little map that's in the annex, that it might be useful to have diagrams relating to some of the options so that it's made clear what we're talking about, where we're talking about, when we're talking about it. And I think, you know, Councillor Kilbane made the point that this is the start of a piece of work we know that we need to do in our city to improve access. We know that historically, our historic city is not the most accessible place, and that there is work that we need to do to improve that. And it was great to hear from Dave about some of the things that have been happening since he joined us to work on that. I do just have a point though, because I know that a couple of councillors have mentioned the potential mitigations that were discussed at the time of decision making by the previous administration, and one of those was the city centre shuttle bus, which was subject of a consultation. The consultation, I think, had some flaws in it. The concept had some flaws in it, but I just wanted to point out that a shuttle bus running around the Foot Streets area would be in itself, you know, a vehicle within the sterile zone. And not only that, but the only way that you could get it to do some kind of circuit would be to take it through streets which none of these options are proposing people drive along. So additional challenges in terms of having the balance between access and safety. So yes, you can drive along a foot street, but that in itself poses a challenge. And many of our foot streets, as anybody will know who has been in the city centre at busy times, are extremely busy during times when many people are enjoying our wonderful city. So I think there's huge challenges in increasing and improving access while taking safety into account. And none of these decisions will be easy, but we've got to remember that we have the duty to make the decision. We have the duty to listen to all of the experts, all of the advice, all of the information that we're given, and make a decision.
Thank you, Councillor Almas. Very helpful contributions there. I have Councillor Nelson on a supplementary new question. Was yours a supplementary, Councillor Fenton? Okay, we'll do Councillor Nelson, then Councillor Fenton, then I'm going to ask a question, and then unless there's any more burning new questions, we'll wrap it up there, if that's okay. Councillor Nelson.
Thank you, Chair. There's just one other aspect of this that I wanted to flag before we kind of finish for the evening, which I feel like is also perhaps something that needs to be incorporated into the reports that go to executive. I was looking at the Care Act 2014 today, which is not a piece of legislation that's been sort of considered, or at least I've seen mentioned in this discussion at all. So I thought it was relevant to say section 1.1 and 2 of the Care Act 2014 say the general duty of a local authority is in exercising its function under this part of the Care Act is to promote that individual's well-being, and it refers to well-being in relation to an individual as relating to participation in work, education, training or recreation, social and economic well-being. So I think there's a legal sort of a piece of legal framework there that we also need to be considering. We are a local authority. We do have those general duties to people who are in the care of our health and social care teams, etc. And many of those people are blue badge holders. I think coming out of this, there's also another question which we need to think about in a wider sense as a local authority, which is that as a council, we commission one-to-one support for people, often blue badge holders, who need one-to-one help to access their local community. Now, I know in the last 3 years, in my ward, there are numerous people that I've spoken to who have not been able to access the city centre either at all, or without professional support. So actually, there's another question there somewhere about council services from other areas of the council having their, resources being used to support people to access the city centre who, if they were able to access that in a car, because without the blue badge ban, may not need those services to access their own local communities. So I just wanted to flag those things. I think they're important for consideration, and they haven't been really seem to be considered in the papers.
Yeah, good shouts then, Councillor Nelson. Thank you. Councillor Fenton, I've got them, by the way.
Thank you, Chair. Just thinking about the point that a public speaker made and others made about level playing field and access to information, and I'm conscious that on previous occasions sitting in this room having discussions and as a member of Scrutiny being asked to almost make that balancing decision ahead of executive making that decision, feeling that there was information that I knew, others knew that we didn't. So I suppose it's a request to James and police colleagues to, whilst respecting the necessity of confidentiality, to think about what information can be shared with as many members who are involved in not just the executive, but other fora across the council where we are being asked to inform decisions, but we don't have access to information that will maybe help us. And maybe thinking back to Andrew Lowson's point around the sort of perceived politicization of this issue, maybe if there'd been better access to information, we could have had a different debate. I mean, I think a low point at one stage last year was then opposition counsel being quoted as suggesting that the terror threat was, if that was a factor in the executive decision, that threat was imagined, and that was I think a low point in that debate. And I think we need to try and move on from that and make sure every member is as well informed as possible, respecting the necessity of restricting information where that's absolutely unavoidable. But just a request really, so that information that can be shared is shared.
Thanks, Councillor Fenton. I've made a note of that. Councillor Kilburn, you wanted to respond to that?
Happy to do that to the max. I would very, very happily share with you absolutely everything that we were told today. But the rule of hostile vehicle mitigation briefings is that nobody talks about hostile vehicle mitigation briefings, and that's the condition for having the briefing. So we can't share that information. But, from what I heard today, I'd very happily share any of it. And as much as we can share, let's share.
I suppose just on that, I'd ask what information is required. I mean, the terror threat as it stands at the moment is obviously substantial. That can be interpreted via the guidance that's on the government website. Obviously, if it's specifics that you're speaking of, then that's a slightly different view. And obviously, but I would suggest that you can't make a holistic decision based on minute detail. It needs to be dealt with via the generalised threat that's obviously public knowledge already.
Thank you. Did I have a supplementary on this conversation over here? No. Okay. I mean, is there any scope to share any more information beyond councillors who have heard today's briefing, even if it isn't that level of information?
I think today's briefing was very similar to the briefing that the previous administration had. It's obviously been brought up to date, but previous administrations have also had briefings in the past. What I will do is talk to the various security agencies. I know they do regular briefings about whether councillors can join those. So there are more generic briefings. They won't necessarily be specific to the city, but there are briefings certainly that councillors can probably join. So I will do some work on that and see if we can include that within the paper.
Thanks, James. Appreciate the sensitivities there, but I think it's worth looking into. Councillor Rowley.
Thank you, Chair. Again, just following on from that and Councillor Kilbane's offer, group leaders. So I'm sure there's a level of information that can be shared with group leaders who who effectively are at that stage. I don't know if there's something that can be shared with everybody, or whether there's just restricted information which maybe could be shared with group leaders. That was just a thought.
Just to reiterate, Councillor Rowley, the rules of the briefing are we can't talk about the briefing. If the experts are happy to share information with others, then great, but it's their call.
Thank you for that.
I was simply going to say we can certainly talk, as James said, to those that are the custodians of that information and see what can be shared.
Thank you. That's helpful. Even the act of asking is helpful, I think. I think it's just me now. Andrew?
Yeah, thank you. Partly going to show off about my excellent filing skills, because I've been just looking at past papers, and I think actually coming back to what was discussed earlier on, we were first talked about the counterterrorism bollards in 2017. I see there's an executive paper, 27th of September 2018, just on the point that was made before. But I think I've done more listening than I suppose being vocal tonight. And I think it was Councillor Nelson who made a good point that, again, yes, it seems to be, when you look at pavement cafes, which obviously I represent a lot of businesses who make money from that, and they've been vocal across the past few years about how they've benefited them, and then when they've been lost, how it's disadvantaged them. But yes, it almost feels like that isn't we're not at that stage to talk about that. I think there's clearly big issues of counter-terrorism and people's right to access the city centre that trump, dare I say it, the issue of pavement cafes. So I think the only thing I'd say really is, once those larger decisions are done, I think a few people have quite rightly said today, is we need to look at the big picture. And again, I know for good reasons people were talking about, what money is brought by the purple pounds, what isn't, can we get data on that? In some ways, I'd say that's not really the issue here, is it? It's looking at these big picture things and what the rights are of people to access the city centre. So I wouldn't really want to be drawn into things like that, even whether it proved the point for our businesses or not.
Yeah.
So I suppose it's all to say that once some of these larger decisions have been made, I think the key thing for businesses is that actually, again, that's where we can look at that detail of where can those compromises be made, sensible decisions. Can we look at streets on a street by street basis and say, how can we get that happy medium of parking spaces access for those who need it, whilst at the same time taking the consideration of, the commercial needs of the businesses around there. So I think that is my main message, speaking on behalf of the bid board, tonight. It's just that's not forgotten about once maybe these more important issues are decided.
Thank you, Andrew. I think that's a really helpful set of points there, really. Councillor Kilbane?
Just to respond directly to that, Chair, certainly welcome that and welcome those conversations. I mean, we're not, and what we are desperately trying to avoid is imbalance, but this isn't top trumps. What we're trying to do here is look at the human rights and do a balance of that based upon proportionality, etc. And quite rightly, once that decision is made, then we will fully engage with all of the stakeholders as to how, whatever that decision is, how it's enacted. And personally, I absolutely love pavement cafes. I think they're great, but that is, as you rightly say, a matter to discuss after the main decision's been made. But yeah, we'll fully engage with that and with the businesses.
Thank you. I mean, the one question I had, and then I've got Flick waiting. Oh, and Councillor, was that supplementary, Councillor? Sure.
A lot of disabled people like pavement cafes too, but they can't go to them at the moment.
Very fair point. Absolutely. Tell you what, I'll come to Flick first and then I'll go. Flick, thank you for waiting once again.
Thank you, Chair. I really wanted to just make the point that life is in fact politics, and the oppression and exclusion of disabled people happens through a series of political choices. I would just like to take the opportunity to remind the committee that the comments that we receive in Reverse the Ban are absolutely heart-wrenching. There are many older disabled people who now have terminal diagnoses and write that they fear that they will now die before ever seeing the city centre again. So I just wanted to make that as my final point to, in a way, reiterate the real humanity of the lives of the people that are impacted by this. Thank you.
Thank you, Flick. Focuses the mind once again. David?
Yeah, just following on from what Flick just said about the comments and people's personal experiences. One of the first things that my support worker, Jan, did, or I'm visually impaired for those who don't know, so she helps me in the workplace, was to go through and try to categorise all of the comments that were made from the postcard campaign. That data is now available. It is based on basic themes along what just about people who are worried they won't make it back into the city centre, those who feel they are banned from the city centre. And much of that is reflected in the comments from the Blue Badge Phase 1 consultation as well. Out of the 1,300 comments we received, there was over 300 highlighting personal experiences. So I think that concern is well made by the disabled community, and I think it's how we analyse and look at that data. And if you'll grant me a little bit of a privilege, Chair, as a disabled person that has recently moved to York, the one thing that was really obvious to me about the current ban in the city centre is that besides the vast majority of the non-disabled public honouring the ban, it would seem that only Blue Badge users did. It seemed like every other organisation and service provider was entering the city centre and breaching the rules. And it seems like only disabled people, and like I said, the vast majority of the public, of course, were honouring the ban despite the impacts that it had on them. And I think that contradicts the aspersions that have been cast on the disabled community historically by some people, to say that we can't drive. I mean, I personally can't drive as a visually impaired person. That would be chaos. You definitely would have to ban me, of course. And it's quite sad, really. We've got, I mean, I said to a friend of mine the other day, every time we come into the city centre, it's the first place I've ever been that I never get bored. There's always something new to do in the city centre. I'm lucky because my partner helps guide me around the centre, and the areas that I don't know, the areas that I know, I can fairly guide myself now. So I'm not physically reliant on that ban. And it dawned on me that people who know the city centre well are being denied that continued access and those memories that they most probably live with the city centre. And it is heartbreaking that some people are saying they most probably will never see the city centre ever again if we don't build on this. And the last thing I wanted to make clear was, in the feedback that we received from Blue Badge 1, I would say of the 1,300 comments that were received and the number of people that didn't want to see the ban reversed were under the assumption that we will open up the whole of the city centre, including the shambles, etc. And there was comments made about that as well.
Interesting.
So, it's one of the many things that I hope people will be able to read once the data has been analysed. But thank you for giving me the opportunity to say that, because to me it's very important.
No, thank you for sharing it. We respect your professional role and your personal experience together. Thank you. I'll try and keep this brief because we've had some nice almost closing remarks there. But one specific question I had, which hasn't really been touched on, it's more of an ask, and I guess I'd like it to be a recommendation, is whether the committee members would be comfortable with asking the executive members who are relevant to liaise with Make It York on exploring completely different ways of doing this Christmas market, It's touched on in the paper as almost like an automatic given that because that exists, we might need to remove the exemption once again on a temporary basis. And I just think it's almost like the pavement cafe argument, but a bit bigger because it's the Christmas market. And I just think as a city, surely we can be a bit more creative than just stacking everyone into Parliament Street. Forgive the slightly crude language. But the committee members have any objection to us putting that ask over? Because it might aid this broader discussion, you know, moving forward. Councillor Fenton.
I'm dredging my memory banks, and it came, I'm sure it came up as a scrutiny request some time ago after last year's Christmas market. And I can't remember whether we asked Make It York and got a response, or whether it wasn't pursued because the municipal year came to an end. I think it's certainly worth seeking a discussion with Make It York to, on the back of concerns raised last year, what potential changes are being considered, or well, given we're nearly in October, I'm sure most of it is kind of already decided.
Yeah.
But I think it would be helpful for us to have that conversation, and into which we could feed in some of the, I'm sure David's already been involved in the discussions, you know, feed into their planning with a view to making it as accessible as possible. So I don't have any problem with us as a scrutiny committee sort of seeking to venture into that territory.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the committee could always have that conversation, but I sort of, if that was to, if that sort of ask was to be put to Make It York, I'd like it to be something that is sort of looked at actively outside of the quite limited committee calendar. But we can always do both. I had a hand. Dave, was that you, David? Yeah.
Yeah, just to say that our work with Make It York has actually been really encouraging. They met with the York Access Forum at the previous meeting, where they openly action, you know, is louder than words, obviously, but they showed a real enthusiasm to listening to the comments that were being made by the forum members, based on access, based on reports of public abusing disabled people for getting in their way, wheelchair users, white cane users, etc. And they've made some changes to this year's Christmas market already, by reducing the number of stalls and getting rid of that big monstrosity they had last year at the top end of the bottom end of Parliament Street. And you know, they are openly engaging with us. So we didn't talk about the parking because we didn't really want to ruin what was going, a conversation that was going quite well, and those decisions are kind of made outside of their powers anyway. But I just wanted to acknowledge that actually Make It York have been really positive in actually engaging now. I understand historically they probably weren't, but they are.
Yeah, and look, I'd certainly concur with that. I think there's been a change in the organisation, and I think the reason I put it forward, I mean, to be honest, I run at many closed doors, to be honest, on a daily basis, but I think that would be pushing at least slightly open door. I think they're probably open to maybe doing things differently moving forward. But look, that's a very specific thing. Councillor Kilburn, and then we'll go on to recommendations.
It might help, Chair, just to, I mean, on a much broader basis, the committee could ask the question, not that I want to dictate your work plan, is, you know, why are we putting on events that exclude residents?
Yeah. Thank you, Councillor Kilburn. Well put, as ever. Right. So look, it's been a lengthy discussion, but I think we all expected that would be the case. I'm very, very grateful to everyone's contributions, even when the discussion might have got a little bit tense from time to time. I think it's been helpful. I have a list of recommendations that I'd like to run by the committee. And then if after I've gone down that list, others have further, I'm happy to hear them. So I'll run down this list. The first is we've had a couple of mentions about including reports containing research in for the executive papers coming through in October. So there was this report done by an academic at the University of York that Flick mentioned, and the Martin Higgitt's report. I mean, it's a fairly simple thing to include those reports in those executive papers. I'm sure the committee are happy to ask the executive to do that. Okay. Are you making sure I don't say something I'm not allowed to say? That I've put very recently this conversation about the Christmas market. Are committee members comfortable with Scrutiny asking the relevant executive members to open up a conversation with Make It York about future Christmas markets, not excluding, well, any residents almost by default, and utilising the whole city rather than find a slick way of wording that. But any objections to that general? Yes, objections? Yes, there are no objections. Thank you, Councillor Nelson. I fully supported Councillor Lomas's point earlier on about when the October report is put together, we need much more clarity on the options and the detail. I think you mentioned diagrams, maps, that would be helpful. I'd also like to add to that, I think it'd be good if we can ask executive to ensure that the way this issue is talked about is much more even-handed. I'm not suggesting it was done deliberately, but I think there's a few bits of the report that almost downplay some of the issues here. So phrases like some disabled residents, and that it was a postcard petition, wasn't it? Was it 2,500 submissions? It was around 3,000. That's not even mentioned really in here. And I just think in terms of telling the story, which the report has done quite well in terms of the history, it'd be nice to see it more even. I mean, again, we'll find a slick way of wording that. I'm looking at you, Robert, but does anyone have any objections to that from the committee? Okay, thank you. Earlier point made around sort of looking at the numbers. So we've had sort of estimates for the costs of removing barriers, but what about sort of purple pound benefits, the cost of other alternatives? I think it's reasonable to want that executive report to have much more detail on finances as much as is possible. Any objections to that? Okay, thank you. Councillor Nelson has referred to the Care Act and its potential relevance to this discussion. I wondered if we could ask executive members to see if there's a way of working that into future papers and deliberations with officers. Any objections? On a roll here. I did try to catch everything, so there's all sorts of stuff I've got here. We have the request that more information is given to members where possible and appropriate outside of the executive, and we've had certainly an expression that request will be put forward by the officers. So just to get the committee's formal approval to put that question to relevant executive members, so that more councillors are more included with, you know, the key information as much as we're allowed to be. Thank you. And then I wondered if we could also reach a decision as a committee, and say a decision, it's not something we can control, but whether we could say to the relevant executive members that the committee would not want to support option 2, which is effectively do nothing. I mean, we can obviously, all that would be is a communication to the executive members. It's up to them to do what they want to do. Any views on that, colleagues? Councillor Fenton?
I think going back to a point that was raised earlier around we don't have access to all of the information that the decision makers will have. So I think that would cause me difficulties in terms of saying committing to a particular option without having had sight of the up-to-date advice that's alluded to in the report.
Yeah, I think the difficulty we have is that will always be the case unless, you know, in the next few days or weeks, you become the leader of the council, or anyone else becomes the leader of the council. Could be a poison chalice, who knows? And this whole issue does come down to fundamental weighing up of key principles. Otherwise, we might as well all go home. Councillor Nelson.
I was just going to say, I feel like it would be totally reasonable for us to say, based on the information that we are able to see, we can, you know, say that we wouldn't be supportive of option 2. And I would personally very much support that. I'd like to see a change in some way of the residents in my ward being able to access the city centre based on all the information that we have access to. That seems like a reasonable request. And I think you could mitigate that.
I think the way you've articulated it is better than I put it forward. There's a necessary caveat there based on the information that we have access to. I'd be happy to amend that recommendation on that basis. Councillor Fenton.
I think just to come back, I think if this were a pre-decision scrutiny committee, we would have access to, in draft form, the report the executive would have.
Yeah.
And thinking back to pre-decision scrutinies we've done before the November 2021 decision, that did conclude with a vote where the recommendation was put, and a vote was taken on the basis of more information than we've got now. So that's my only hesitation in terms of, you know, if it's put to a vote now, then I'd be inclined to abstain, just because this isn't a pre-decision scrutiny meeting. If it were, I think it would be entirely reasonable to. I feel as though we would have more information than perhaps we've got in this sort of truncated report.
I see. But again, I think the difficulty we'll have is there will always be based on the information that we have now, that sort of status of not having the full information will be permanent unless you were to be in a position where you would have the full suite. Superintendent.
Just really to manage expectations, accepting we will obviously share what we are able to share. I think the committee and the executive need to work on the basis they have the information that they have access to that is publicly available, and not search for something that perhaps isn't there. The sensitivities around everything else perhaps may or may not be relevant, but I think you need to understand that this may be the totality of what you have got access to for the decision.
Indeed, yes, thank you. Now on that basis, look, if we can't have every single member of the committee supporting that recommendation or position given to the executive members that we would not want them to pursue option 2, given the information that we have access to, then if there's no consensus on that, we'll put it to a vote. It'd be great to have consensus on that, given that we're never going to get that full suite of information by the sounds of it. What do we think? Do we have consensus or not? 2 hands. You're both really close. I'm not sure. So
mine's not actually on the vote, by the way.
Okay, all right. I'll come back to you. Councillor Pearson.
I don't feel that any of the options presented this evening reflect what I feel, which is that it needs to be under constant review. And I also, with regards to option 1 in particular, I'd really want to know the nitty-gritty details of what the option is, because if that's bollards all the way across St Helens Square, and it's like a second layer of defence, I need to know more to be able to actually come to a decision on that. So, and I don't have all the information.
Fair enough, but that was the purpose of the caveat of saying based on the information that we have. But look, if that's your position, that's your position. You have a different point, Councillor Healy?
Yes, your list of
additions to the paper, you missed off my one that takes us back
Yeah, good point.
further. Because I do think from 207 to 2011, it wasn't a discussion point at all. And that was the first time the council started to discuss, and then it sort of moved on. So historical perspective, basically.
So a recommendation to ask the executive members to work with officers on from the executive report, a longer timeline of relevant decisions is included, because you're suggesting there were relevant decisions previous.
So try and pick up Councillor Lomas's point. On Nelson, sorry. Well, you're down there, sorry. If on page 20.29 background, it started at 2011 or 12 or whenever the first papers were written. And apologies to Councillor Nelson and Councillor Lomas.
And Councillor Whitcroft, who was at school then.
I mean, look, we can put that request over to the executive members, like with all of these recommendations, that is all they are. Yeah. Well, I'm comfortable with that. Were you going to say something then, Dan? No?
I was just trying to see if we do actually have reports that go that far.
Ah, I see. Okay. Fair enough. And I think my final recommendation that I've made a note of is, I don't have the best way of wording it right now, but to give the executive members a steer, or to recommend to them that the future debate and decisions surrounding this issue squarely focus on access versus security, and not access versus security versus pavement cafes, or access versus pavement cafes. I think, look, it's just a recommendation, but I think there's real value in taking that off the table and keeping it about those two big things. Can we get consensus on that? Councillor Healy?
To say this is a complicated decision would be underestimating it. There are other factors apart from just access and apart from just security. There are I would broaden it out from pavement cafes. So I think I'd broaden it out from pavement cafes. There is wider economic issues. And remember, this is a pedestrianised zone. And as a parent of a young child who was unable to be here today, I find it strange that we have a pedestrianised zone that previously had cars basically driving around it. So as a parent of a young family who goes into a pedestrianised zone and you take less notice of your children and the road, I would argue a point that keeping it as it is from a young family's perspective would be of a benefit. So there are a multitude of issues on this, and the executive is basically paid to look at that multitude of issues, not just a security versus access point, because it is wider than that.
I think that's, you know, I don't think anything you've said there directly clashes with what I was proposing, but I think the reason why I've proposed it in those specific terms is that this report places a strange and arguably premature amount of letters and words on paper around pavement cafes, when as has been mentioned already, we need to bottom out these bigger principles first and exactly what the council's position is on them. And once the council or the executive work out how they want to proceed, those finer details will be ironed out. And I think the report also says that it wouldn't necessarily mean the elimination of those, I think it's 19 cafes are cited in the report. Every one will be slightly different. That detail will be worked out. But again, you don't have to vote for the proposal. It's fine. See you later. Thanks for sitting in. So look, that's my full list. So it sounds like there's two that we might need to take a quick vote on. Were there any more? from colleagues, committee members? Councillor Pearson?
Thanks, Chair. It's might be for the work plan, which is the next item, but around bringing the action plan back to committee at a later date.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good point. I think that is a work plan one, but definitely. Any more hands? In that case, okay, so we'll have two votes on two of the proposals where we don't have consensus. The first is that the committee advises the relevant executive members that it would not want the executive to proceed with option 2 of the 3 available. Raise your hands in favour. Against? Abstentions? 4 abstentions. Okay, that's fine. Have you got that? Thank you. And the second one where we might not have consensus is advising the relevant executive members that the committee would like the future debate and decisions on this matter to focus primarily on the principles of access versus security and not access versus pavement cafes to the extent that has been focused on in this paper before us. Councillor Fenton.
I think the important word there for me is primarily.
Okay.
So I think I'm happy with that.
Okay.
Primarily, not exclusively.
Always happy to find a compromise. Councillor Fenton. I think primarily. Councillor Pearson's the vice chair. You guys should know that by now. But I'm happy with primarily if colleagues are happy with primarily. I mean, look, it's just a recommendation, but I think it's valuable that the public see this issue progressing through the council system, even in a scrutiny format, and steer being given where it possibly can be given. Do we need to take a vote on that, or do we now have consensus on that? If we go with primarily. Perfect. Well, consensus on all but 1 and 4 abstentions on that one. That brings this item to an end. Thank you genuinely, those who've given up their evenings and those who've watched in the room and at home. I hope I haven't compromised British Bake Off. I don't know when it starts. I stopped watching it a few series ago. But this meeting is not quite finished yet. Those concerned with Blue Badge access, feel free to go and enjoy the rest of your evenings. Thank you. The next item is simply a look at the work plan. We've got a new request tonight from Councillor Pearson, following up from the previous discussion, which is to try and get an update on this. I mean, what are we calling it? Accessibility Action Plan, at the earliest opportunity. Now, look, colleagues, this committee's work plan, this is meaty, and it's not even the worst of the scrutiny committees. Yeah. Thank you very much. Take care. Councillor Healy, have a good evening. But look, can we say for this moment, we can add this action plan to the work plan wish list, and then I'm happy to have a conversation offline with all committee colleagues about finding a better place or a clearer place to put it. Because it's been a nightmare doing this work plan and fitting things in and trying to satisfy each element of the economy, place, access, transport remit, and also keep an eye on the executive's priorities. So look, I'm happy to add it to a wish list. I think it'd be great to get an update on that. So normally these work plans do have a wish list. And so for instance, there's an unallocated item around planning enforcement, which I think Councillor Avilius raised during our work planning session, but didn't make the cut. I'm happy to add it onto that list. I know the public speaker, Gwen Swinburne, had a request or requests about tracking, I think, capital projects and highways maintenance, tracking spend on capital projects. Thank you, Daniel, or Dan, forgive me. I'm happy to discuss with officers how feasible that is. I'd be comfortable having that kind of item as a standing piece on all of our agendas, so colleagues can refer to it, raise comments, concerns, if they see anything on there that is worth flagging up and maybe delving into in more detail in the future. I'm just not sure about resource, and like every single council service, even the council's democratic function is under constant strain and pressure. Councillor Fenton, are you gearing up to say something then, or no? Okay. Fair enough. But I'm sure you appreciate the pressures that them services team are under. So I'm happy to certainly take Ms Swinburne's requests forward. Councillor Ben Burton, is that a hand? It is a hand.
Just on Gwen's comments, I don't think we need it to come back as an item for discussion, but it would be good just for, as a committee, to push around that issue of the highways design manual, because it is something that's popped up at planning committee already, and it's a document that'd be really useful for the council to have, and it's an issue that's been going for years when I was working here, in terms of the council not having a very good or effective highways design manual. So it would be good that we push for that to be delivered, essentially.
Okay, yeah. Thank you, Councillor Burton. I've got that down here as an unallocated item, along with the others. Councillor Pearson, you're all at it now.
Sorry, yeah, I think just tying into what Ms Swinburne commented on was around understanding and having a bit more transparency about how highway schemes are prioritised, which is probably part of the same thing.
Yeah.
It's always a bit of a mystery as to what roads are prioritised for resurfacing and all the rest of it. So.
Yes, indeed. I would agree with that analysis. I'm sure there is a method in there somewhere. But yeah, I've added that sort of extra detail to this list. It might well be the case that the chair of this committee post our last currently planned one, which would be after April, looks at this and other items that aren't yet allocated. But let's see, events can change things, and there might be there's always a bit of jiggery pokery with work plans, isn't there? For want of a better phrase. But with that, I'm happy to close that item. And unless, do we have the urgent business item? We do. Is there any urgent business? I'm not aware of any. Thank you, Councillor Hook. Thank you, everyone, for your time and contributions tonight. And it's not been easy or straightforward at times, but all very important and necessary, and I'm sure valued by those concerned, or hopefully valued by those concerned.